Top Girls was a play whose ideas came together over a period of time and in quite sort of separate parts. And I think some years before I wrote it, I'd had an idea for a play where a whole lot of people from the past, dead women, came and had a cup of coffee with someone who was alive now. And that was just floating around as something quite sort of separate by itself. Then I started thinking about a play possibly to do with women at work, and went and talked to quite a lot of people doing different jobs. And one of the places I visited was an employment agency, which later then became a focus on the play. Then there was an idea of doing a play in which all the characters were women, and having just a huge range of different parts and giving women the opportunity to play lots of roles on stage which they don't always get to play. And various other elements as well. And then at some point, as I began to get the idea for the play to do with people working, those other ideas sort of came back and fitted into the same play.
Top Girls was first performed at the Royal Court Theatre, London, in August 1982. It then transferred to New York, returning to the Royal Court in February 1983. The play was revived in 1991. The televised version was recorded after 4 weeks' rehearsal, prior to a national tour of the stage production and another run at the Royal Court. Both the 1982 and the 1991 productions were directed by Max Stafford-Clark.
Certainly the play, when it was first produced in its first run at the court, played to around 65 or 70%. It was not an immediate box office hit. We then took it to America, to Joseph Papp's Public Theatre, where it was billed as a huge London success and played to a large audience and was very successful. We then returned to the Royal Court with it, where it was billed as a huge American success, and the play was very successful. But I think it built rather than being an immediate success with the public. And of course, Caryl, although a promising writer, was by no means the established writer that she is today.
It was the first production of a play. I do usually like to be involved in the production and go to the rehearsals and be involved in the casting and be at the rehearsals and take quite a close part in it. And then after that, I usually just sort of let it go and people can do more or less what they like with it. With Top Girls, I was involved in the production in the way of casting and then of being at rehearsals all the time, and some rewrites went on during the rehearsal period, so I was quite closely involved in the production.
Max has a way of working which includes a process which he calls actioning, which I think was crucial to the production.
He will break down a scene into sections, and the sections of that breaking down will determine which character is controlling that section of the scene and what that character wants to achieve. And then you break that section down into smaller sections so that in fact every sentence or even half sentence, every thought change in fact, has what's called a transitive verb attached to it. And an example of that is you could say something very simple like, how was your day? But you would give that statement a transitive verb so that you would say, Marlene, for example, in Top Girls, Marlene wants to interest Joyce. So that would therefore determine the way you presented that line to Joyce.
I'll just show you something from the script. Here, look, this is the last bit of the last scene. When Marlene says, come on, Joyce, what a night. You've got what it takes. We've got... Marlene softens Joyce. Come on, Joyce, what a night. Praises Joyce. You've got what it takes. Joyce resists Marlene. I know I have. Marlene befriends Joyce. I didn't really mean all that. Joyce educates Marlene. I did. So even on, tiny little phrases, it's getting the intention behind the line that gives the line so much power. With both Isabella Bird and Joyce, I wanted to make both of them much warmer, I think, than I had in the original production.
The approach to the play was very much a collaborative one. The actors, the director and the writer Caryl Churchill all contributed a great deal in rehearsal. There were a couple of actresses who'd been in the original production, and of course Caryl had been around at the birth of the play, and so she brought her wisdom and experience from that production to ours. And of course Max had directed the play before, so he knew it very well indeed. So for the rest of us who were new, it was terrific having that kind of experience on board.
There is a markedly different way of rehearsing a television play to rehearsing a stage play. But the reason that it was the same in Top Girls was because Max Stafford-Clark was directing both versions, and his methods are very particular. But I think what does come into play is the actor's ability to modify their performance. I mean, on television, a small statement or gesture or a thought, you can be very subtle because the camera's here and it can see your eyes and, the thought processes that are going on. But when you're on stage, obviously you want to maintain that subtlety and that smallness, but you have to technically find the way of getting it to a much wider audience without appearing over the top with it.
When we approached the television production, we took the decision to move one of the scenes in the agency, the scene between Janine and Marlene, from its place, which was in the body of the first act, to the beginning, so that it provided a context for the play, and so you'd seen Marlene at work. And that, and the credits going through the interview, I recall as being a successful adaptation for television. But otherwise, I think we made very few concessions for a television audience.
The decision to move the interview scene to the beginning was something I was involved in. It was Max's suggestion, I think, that it would be a good idea to show Marlene at the beginning, so that we've sort of focused on Marlene and knew who she was and knew what she did. And at that point of view, I thought it was a good idea, and I liked it a lot, and I was involved in that. I think that, though, combining that perhaps with the entrance with that set, with Marlene coming down the stairs, and then the Marlene and the waitress, I feel it makes a bit of a slow start to the play. In fact, when I originally wrote it, it started even further in. It started with Marlene and Isabella already talking.
I sent for my sister Henny to come and join me. I said, Henny will live here forever and help the natives.
That was one of the things that we changed in rehearsals. We put that first scene, I wrote that first scene between Marlene and the waitress to set up what was happening. And I think that probably is a good idea. But again, I think in the television we perhaps have slightly too many lead-ins with hindsight, for which I take complete responsibility, and I was there too. But I think perhaps it was a bit too much.
When we came to do the second version in 1991, I don't really think any of us realised how much of a historical piece it had become. But it had, because it was very much a sort of document of the 80s and that time. I happen to have some old Cosmopolitans from about 1980, 81. And it was extraordinary to look at those and to see how much in those magazines all the articles were to do with high flyers and women making it on their own, and you don't need a man, and babies, the myth of motherhood, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas the cosmopolitans of the 1990s were much more concerned with parenting and new age and babies, and it was just a completely different view of women.
The scene is very different on film because, of course, the camera is the eye, and you can choose exactly which pair of women, which conversation to focus on. And those decisions were hard, whereas in the theatre, by the direction, you have to focus. And sometimes you give audiences an alternative. You give equal weight to a conversation on both extremes of the table, and the audience then have a choice which conversation they're going to listen to. A television audience doesn't really have that choice, and you determine which is more important by where the camera is.
It was interesting to me that the BBC production selected what appeared to be quite a fancy restaurant and a round table for the women to sit at, which of course provides for great intimacy and exchange between the women, but at the same time is only possible with the camera. And for the stage, the interpretation that I selected, both, again, pragmatics and theme working together, because you can't seat people around a table like that in the theater. So I knew that I had to get them all on one side of the table.
Griselda's in Boccaccio and Petrarch and Chaucer because of her extraordinary marriage. I like to look at the Romans.
When we were filming the dinner party scene for the BBC, the camera was, it took ages to film it, 3 days in fact. And it's a 40-minute scene. I mean, obviously we did it in many ways, in many angles. Everyone would do it in close-up form, mid-close-up, long shot. A track going all the way around the outside of the table so that the camera could go around there and do us all. And then there was another table brought in that was slightly bigger, and it had a hole in the middle, so that the camera and the cameraman could go in the middle of the table and circle round us that way. I just remember with that scene, we knew we were going to have to, it was going to be long, pedantic, we would have to do loads of bits again and again and again and again. And of course with the food as well, that became, I probably ate 28 rare steaks in 3 days.
And the choice of the women was fairly arbitrary. It was people who happened to have caught my fancy at that time, and I would have been hard put to it, I think, to particularly say why any of them. Though when I started to look at what they might talk about, what they had in common, I began to realize that some of the things were that they'd made big changes in their lives, that quite often they'd traveled, quite often they'd had difficulties about combining having children with the other things that they'd done. And you began to see what those things were in common. But basically it was just that they were all people with extraordinary stories who were interesting to hear about. In relation to this particular play, it suddenly seemed a way of putting Marlene in a context of being someone who was celebrating extraordinary achievements, and that we would look at her as sort of feminist heroine who had done things against extraordinary odds, so that we could then have a different attitude to her as the play went on, and we began to question what her values actually were.
Well, I loved Isabella. I thought she had great spirit, and in fact, I've got these notes, which were the first day's rehearsal in 1982, a diary I kept. And Caryl Churchill felt that adventure and a sense of fun were the most important things for Isabella. And she was a wonderful mixture of very proper, straight-laced Victorian behaviour, coupled with an indomitable spirit and great courage and a will for adventure.
Dalgret doesn't say very much, so that was the first clue to her character. Why didn't she say very much? The picture that Dalgret comes from is by Bruegel, and it's a woman fighting demons that have come to Earth from hell. And her children have all been killed, so she's avenging their deaths. I thought very hard about how one would feel if one had seen one's children being killed, and the kind of trauma that that would have on you. And so that was my interpretation of her silence, that actually, not that she didn't have anything to say, but that actually she had too much to say. And Caryl gives her a speech at the end of the act which explains her silence. Her physicality is part of her dialogue, and that was covered by the camera at certain points. Max chose when to use shots of her stealing food and her facial expressions and so forth. And in the theatre, that there were moments that were marked deliberately, so that that was part of Dalgret's dialogue, just as any of the other characters might have used one of their lines.
When I was rehearsing Patient Griselda, I found it quite difficult, and I think that in the end, you have to give in to what she is. And I think that all my values as a woman in this play, with 7 formidable other actresses who are all playing these rather strong women, you know. I didn't want to come on and be Patient Griselda. I wanted to come on and, you know, be defiant and tell this horrendous story and say, and isn't he appalling, and I left him, and but the fact that she says, he did this to me and he did that to me and he took my children away and he pretended that he'd killed them, and but no, of course I stayed with him, of course he was my husband, I had to do it. And I think I just sort of resisted it for too long. It was ridiculous, you can't.
Part of the act is a fantasy. It's fantastic in the sense that it holds out the hope of some feminist historical continuity between these women. However, the core of the act is not only these 5 women from history, but really the fact that Marlene refuses to reveal any of herself, even when other women are talking about their children, their lovers, their husbands, their families. Marlene remains silent about her sister, about Angie, about her origins.
One option for the first production was to do it with, I think, 13 or 14 actors. And that was an option that we considered before rejecting it. And only then did the doubling and who doubled what come into play. And one of the reasons that we rejected having a larger number of actors was because clearly we could hit a particular resonance by having Dalgret and Angie, to name but one, doubled by the same actor.
I think it's tempting and teasing and tantalising to imagine it for yourself. I mean, obviously there are comparisons to be made between Joyce and Isabella Bird, between Dalgret and Angie. There are huge significances that you can create. Personally, I felt the tripling of Janine, Patient Griselda and Nell was not relevant. And I believe some productions have altered the doubling. I don't think you can do it that much. It's probably, I'm treading on writer's ground here, but it's probably more of a who can be on stage having this debate and who has to be off stage changing for the next scene, and who can literally play that part and this other part as well. Because apart from Marlene, everyone plays more than one part. So I would say, you know, one's imagination can run riot and think what you like. But my feelings are that there isn't huge significance to be attached to the doubling. You've probably got footage of Caryl Churchill saying there's enormous relevance.
I think if I was doing it just for television, I probably wouldn't have the doubling of characters, which I think is something that works very well in the theatre, because you get the pleasure of seeing those same people doing things twice, and of knowing it's a compact company there under your eyes doing a show. And also it's, just in terms of the company, it makes for a more closely knit company if you've just got a few people, everyone having a good evening with plenty of work to do, which it wouldn't be if each person just played a part. On television, I think the doubling isn't so effective. I think it's more confusing, and it may look as if it's making points that it isn't. I mean, there isn't any particular significance in the doubling. Inevitably, I think you tend to get a feeling of, if you see one person playing several parts, that those parts are thematically connected. And Top Girls isn't a play where that really happens. Unlike Cloud 9, where it was deliberately written as a play to be doubled, Top Girls wasn't. I first used overlapping dialogue in another play I'd written a while before, a play called Seymour Sleepless Nights. And what happens in that play is that there are two couples who are quarrelling at night, and the first couple have the kind of quarrel where you talk all the time, both talk all the time over each other, and the second couple have the sort of quarrel where you can't really speak to each other and left huge silences. And in doing that, I set it out as 2 columns of talk, and put the odd slash in to show exactly where people cut in. And then when I came to do Top Girls, I was sort of roughing out the scene in terms of these great chunks of the things that the different people had done, and I wanted them to be able to tell in their stories of each other. And I thought this is going to be incredibly laborious and boring and contrived, because everyone's going to be telling their stories. And I thought that the way to make it work was to make them overlap and talk in the way that they would more naturally at a dinner where everyone would be joining in together.
Caryl, of course, pioneered, too, the intercut overlapping dialogue that she used to carry further in plays like Serious Money that she wrote later. And that, and the difficulty of rehearsing that and the testing out of whether or not that overlapping dialogue arrived at the same place, was very much part of the initial rehearsal process.
It was horrendously difficult to learn, because not only do you have to learn your lines, you have to learn exactly the moment that you interrupt. And I mean exactly, you know, it's not arbitrary when you come in.
It did mean that we had to not cheat, but we had to sort of choreograph things slightly, because the tendency was to get your story across, so that everybody, sometimes in rehearsal, everybody just started shouting when everybody was speaking in the overlapping bits.
What you can do is you can rehearse it in such a way, which is what the bulk of those rehearsals were about once we'd got the characters and everything, was about focusing on who we want the audience to look at. You know, you've got 7 women having dinner, 6 women having dinner. Who do we want the audience to look at? So it's not just a question of who speaks loudest, it's a question of passing the baton successfully, so that the audience have some of the work done for them. On television it was slightly harder, because of course the camera decides who the audience is looking at. And that presents an enormous number of problems, and I think inevitably takes something away from the scene. I think it's best enjoyed as a whole picture, and then you, the audience, decides who you want to look at.
I think that one of the reasons for the overlapping dialogue is that it establishes the one-on-one relationship that Marlene has with each of these women, that they are not friends with each other, but they are pieces of Marlene's collective herstory that she wishes to cherish, to reinvigorate. And I think they represent for Marlene the only friends she's got. I think it's very important that there are no friends, family, or colleagues at this party, but there are these women from history. So I think that as she talks to each of them, they're almost single conversations.
It's really a statement about these women and their willingness, or lack of willingness in this case, to listen to one another, One story excites another story, but they never seem to gain any intimacy, to have any kind of bond over the stories that they're hearing, because they're always talking over one another. And there are certain moments where the women are silent, key moments where we hear the kind of central kernel of their story, and then there's a lot of time where they just talk over and through one another.
I think that in the television production, the argument between Marlene and Joyce is enormously powerful, and we took that in, I think, 3 takes, so that it was a scene that we'd rehearsed and run as we would for a stage production, which I think is probably rather unusual for television.
The final scene, which I think is really wonderful, tells us something about Marlene. We don't really know anything about her except that she's successful. And we don't really know her sister or her daughter fully yet. But between Joyce and Marlene is a kind of class warfare. It's not simply sisters fighting, but they become in this final scene 2 representatives of 2 very, very different positions. I think Marlene is acting. She is performing the part of the successful woman. She takes to it. She does it very well. She takes to it very naturally. But this becomes very apparent in the final act of the play when we see her going not exactly home but to her sister's house. We see her in the context of the working class environment from which she came, and we see the distance that she had to go to create the Marlene that we see at the Top Girls agency.
I think there's always a bit of you that's performing something that you're not. So therefore there is an element to Marlene of her performing the successful woman. I think that gets less and less the more that becomes your running condition. I think that's why she's so tough at it. You know, there mustn't be an opening for anyone to get in and say, but you're only that. Look where you've come from. Who are you to speak? Whatever. It's a very difficult part. It is very complicated, and one of the areas that I had not problems with, but there's always something about a character that is like a hurdle. And with Marlene, it was her political passion. It was her belief in Thatcherism and the individual and autonomy and selfishness and, you know, that greedy colour that she has to her. Although there are enormous resonances, family resonances for myself in playing Marlene. So that I got for nothing, as it were, you know. That thing of breaking away from your background, becoming something that you're not, in a way, nurtured to become.
Well, Joyce was a great challenge for me. I think she is a wonderful character. In a superficial reading of the play, you could say she was the hero and Marlene was the bad one. But the play is sufficiently well written so that there are qualities in both of them that are good and bad. I mean, Joyce is absolutely rooted in her past and doesn't particularly want to change. She wants a better life obviously she wants a better life for herself and for Angie and a better life for everybody. But she is very scathing about Marlene's ambitions and thinks they're very superficial. I mean, she's a sort of salt of the earth character, really. What Joyce represents is something that Marlene doesn't want anymore.
And I suppose what she would want to say to Joyce is, I love you, but I really don't want to see you. I really can't be with you. I really can't embrace this life anymore. But the problem is Joyce is a highly intelligent woman. And one of my favourite bits of the last scene is, you know, they have all this stuff, they say all these things, everything's exposed. And then Marlene says, in true kind of, in the real fashion that she's kind of moulded herself into, where you kind of do all this, but then you say, oh, but I'm still Mrs. Nice, Miss Nice, Ms. Nice. She says to Joyce, I didn't really mean all that, which is nonsense. Of course she meant it all, but, that's the glossy face you have to present. She says, I didn't really mean all that, and Joyce just says, I did.
I think Joyce loves Marlene very much, and I think Marlene loves Joyce very much. But equally, there is enormous resentment, because, and that's where the interest lies, because it's not just black and white. Joyce does resent Marlene coming back and taking over. She feels incredibly threatened by Marlene, because Marlene could just come and take Angie off, and then that would be her life, because as Angie has grown up, and as she says in the last scene, she couldn't have another baby.
I think Angie compares Joyce and Marlene, and I think she picks up on the friction that there is between them, and I think she adores Marlene, aspires to be Marlene, and wants to escape from Joyce, but loves Joyce very much, but she kind of worships Marlene.
I think Angie has inherited a lot of her mother's drive. Angie wants to get out. Angie wants to go around the world. Angie wants to kill Joyce, she's a blueprint Marlene.
There's a cunning and a slyness in Angie that have been nurtured by her isolation. I thought very much that she spends quite a lot of time on her own and thinks things through. Even if she thinks slowly, she still thinks very well. And the fact that she's managed to get to London on her own, to telephone Marlene, that she's remembered information that Marlene has given her years ago, actually suggests that she's not stupid, but that actually, she's quite bright, given different circumstances. That actually she wouldn't be someone who's been left behind by society.
You feel all right? Yes, thank you.
So where's Joyce?
She's at home.
It's hard to think Angie doesn't overhear that conversation if you're at all naturalistically minded. But I don't think I meant her to when I wrote it, in that I don't think I meant when she says, Marlene's my mother, I think, my aunt, my mother, in that scene in the hut when she says that she thinks Marlene's really her mother. I didn't mean her to know it. I meant it to be wishful thinking. But if she'd heard it, she would have known it. And I think when you see the play, you can't help wondering if she's heard it. I don't think I meant her to, really.
The end of the play is quite ambiguous in that you see Angie's in her bedroom and Joyce and Marlene have that terrific row. You don't know whether Angie has actually heard them rowing, heard what they've said, and that her final words are because of that or because of something else. I think that Angie intuitively knows that Joyce isn't her mother, but I wouldn't. And I think that the thing is that she would love someone like Marlene to be her mother without realising that Marlene actually is.
I don't think Angie has overheard any conversation between Marlene and Joyce, and I think Angie's been asleep and has had a nightmare and has woken up. So that frightening, which is the last line of the play, applies to the dream that she's had. Also, in the context in which we see it, it applies to the decade to come and the prospects of someone like Angie. I don't think it's necessary for an audience to think that Angie has overheard Marlene and Joyce's conversation in order for Angie to be in a hideous situation. The situation and prospects for Angie are already grim enough without her learning that.
I felt that in the BBC version of the play, Angie's final entrance was very much divorced from the scene around it. I felt that, in a sense, she was in a world of her own there. She was frightened, perhaps wakened from a dream. She has all of those discussions about nuclear war with her friend, and she comes in very much in her own world. In my production and for the stage, I wanted to reinforce that Angie had a stake in the relationship between these two women. And so just after the part where the sisters discuss that Joyce is actually, in fact, raising Marlene's daughter, I had Angie come out into the hall to listen. Now, she's careful to run back to her room when Joyce goes to bed. But in the final scene of the play, in my interpretation, Angie comes out with a question. She's not coming out in a nightmare. She's not coming out in her own world. She's coming into the scene between the sisters. And she is asking Marlene, "Are you my mother?" And I think what that does for the play as a whole and for my interpretation is it gives the audience one last opportunity to see the kinds of decisions that Marlene has been forced into, the way that her life and the choices she's made have forced her into a distance from the personal, a complete inability to have a relationship with this child who she on some levels wants to connect with. So that as she enters and says, "Mom," Marlene has to choose. She has to identify herself, and she finally capitulates. No, it's Auntie Marlene.
Joan gives birth, but her child is taken away from her, of course. Nijo gives birth to, I think it's 3 or 4 children, doesn't see them. Griselda has her children taken away from her. And Marlene, of course, gives her child up willingly to her sister. So the theme really is not so much about motherhood, but about lost motherhood, mothers and children who are lost and don't find each other, who aren't conscious of each other. And in the second half, it's Angie's search for her mother without realising that that's what she's doing.
It's very hard to imagine somebody who gives up their child. It's virtually impossible to come to terms with somebody doing that as a substitute or in return for their success. I think as long as Angie is neatly packed away in the country with Joyce, she can send her presents and, you know, do all of that. It's all right. It is the absent father syndrome, you know. It's racked with guilt, but I don't think she spends a lot of time being guilty about it. You know, she's dealt with it. It's like with Marlene, you know, well, nothing's a problem. You just deal with it. You know, she's had 2 abortions. She just she deals with that. You don't want it, you get rid of it. You want it, you have it, and then you deal with it, whatever. It's this disposable people in your life, you know, disposable lifestyle. Anything you don't need, you get rid of. And Angie's not going to help her at all. So she got rid of her.
Well, it's interesting because motherhood is spoken about all through this play in ways that I think are yet largely unexamined. And this is an example of what I mean about the difference between the social, personal, and psychological. We can look at Marlene and we can say, yes, she had real reasons for leaving her daughter with her sister Joyce. But we can also look at Angie not only simply as a daughter who is abandoned, but as representative of a whole class of people who, under the policies of the 1980s in Great Britain, are also abandoned. So she is larger than herself.
It seemed like a good idea for the name of the agency, I think, because there are things called Top Shop and Top this and Top that. And it seemed likely that something like that agency would call itself something like that and use the word girls rather than women, and it just seemed like a good title for the agency. And once it was a title for the agency, it seemed like a good name for the play.
Top Girls really accurately describes Marlene, Wynne, and Nell, her colleagues at the employment agency. But it's also an ironic title in that it connotes something other than its literal meaning. I think one of the things that Churchill is after in this play is what is the nature of women's responsibility to other women, especially women who have been very, very successful. What Marlene, Wynne, and Nell all champion is being tough. And if you're not tough, you can't make it, and therefore you're out. So these women are very successful, they're top girls, but what's the nature of their accomplishment if they don't have any social or political consciousness that extends beyond their own pursuits?
You could look at the word girl and understand what that word tells us about the patriarchal capitalist society that says you could be 65 and still be a girl because you're never going to be given mature adult responsibilities. You're going to be kept in a subservient position. So I think that girl is very important. I think that top, as it modifies girl, tells us so much about Marlene. She is a success, yes, but she is still a top girl. She is in an industry which is populated by women. You know, many, many employment agencies are staffed almost wholly by women. And so she's a top girl, and though she's been promoted in the play, I'm not sure that she will ever get to the top of top girls. I think that there's a beautiful irony in the title Top Girls as it inflects the entire play, and that we must consider that carefully because Joyce is also a girl. And Joyce hasn't even gotten a chance to be at the top. She has been working in the homes of the top girls. So I think that the title of this play draws us to Marlene and her dilemma, but I think it also colors Joyce, and it certainly comments on the historical characters.
Lots of people ask me if Top Girls is a feminist play, and it's a hard one to answer because I think there can be lots of misinterpretations about feminism, and I think it's a very subjective issue anyway. And I wouldn't want to give the play that kind of a label.
From one perspective, Top Girls is a positive play for women in that it takes a very hard, critical look at what success means for women. And what it means is not always happy. Women aren't necessarily for other women. I would say that that hard, critical look is very useful and ultimately serves feminist interests very well.
One of the reasons that Top Girls is an important feminist play for me is a factor that's entirely outside of the content of the play. And that is that this is a play which employs actresses, that provides parts, and good ones, for 7 women. And it seems to me that we have to look beyond content to the world of the theater and say that this is a play which makes a feminist statement, but it's a play which also employs women and provides an economic base in that arena.
It's very difficult to know whether or not to to describe a writer as a feminist writer. It's feminist in the point that it's a play about women. There isn't one man in it. But it's not just about female politics, it's about politics too. And certainly we found when we did the production in 1991 that there was a considerable response from people who'd seen the production in 1982, that the play had been very prophetic in that it had been written about Thatcher's children making good, and that in the early 90s, as Britain discovered the chickens came home to roost, really, and things weren't quite as wonderful as they thought they were going to be in the early 80s. So, yes, I suppose it is a feminist play, but I think it's a political play. I think it's an extremely political play.
I think Top Girls is definitely a feminist play. I think it was written as a response to the early 80s and the whole thing of Thatcher becoming Prime Minister, where, I mean, that was an enormous event and had a lot of repercussions, and people were saying, well, look, a woman can become that, that's fantastic. And so I think Caryl wanted to look at the connection of feminism and politics and take it on a broader issue. Actually, I'll refer to my notes again. This is the first meeting in July 1982. Caryl spoke about the play. Said she'd started out with the idea of extraordinary women, then what choices and sacrifices to be that. On whose terms? Mimicking men in a men's world. Defining the problem ultimately in a broader political spectrum than merely women overcoming their oppression. So that was sort of like, from the horse's mouth, that was sort of a general view of what it was all about.